One of my good friends from the Rose City Garden Railway Society attended the 2023 National Garden Railroad Convention held in the San Francisco area. He unexpectedly met and fell in love with this locomotive. This is an Accucraft solid brass K27. His goal is to get it to work with the rest of his Airwire gear on dead rail. Follow along while we see what's involved in making this rather amazing model do just that. This is a truly complex model. One of the things I'm hoping is we don't have to take the locomotive too far apart. And we don't know anything about the provenance of this model. We know it's at least 20 years old, and we'll talk more about how we figured that out a little bit later. So the first round is sort of, pop the covers. Let's see what's making the noise right now. A quick examination of the interior shows moderately okay craftsmanship using a Big Sound 97. That is also a way we can date this motor. And of course the usual stuff, my favorite thing, the most heat generating component has a big hunk of double sticky foam holding it in place, or held it in place. There's also a lead acid battery. That's pretty old. But the good news is there's lots of room. There's lots of room inside this tender. Since this project already has a Phoenix sound card, albeit a pretty old one, it's still totally functional. All we really need to make this project move forward is a battery, pretty fat one, and a decoder that suits the environment of the customer's already established garden railroad. So. I talked long and hard about creating a sort of a provenance for these locomotives, and so here I am working on the documentation package. I generally do one of these for every locomotive I work on. This one's no different. The manual from Accucraft is available. It's pretty slender. There's not much in it. But there is a lot of information, and of course the Phoenix people are still alive, and you can still get the manual for the sound card, which was good, and of course the manual for the G4. All of these will get little flags and notes and highlights as I move forward with custom configuration. I already know what cards are going to be installed and roughly where they're going to go, so we turn the 3D printer loose, making a couple brackets so we don't have to actually use any adhesive on the card itself. While the 3D printer is going, we'll take a look inside here and get the existing card out of place while taking note of what the wiring is. There's a lot of extra wiring. This train was set up to accept reed magnet chuff and whistle signals. I'm sorry, not chuff, crossing signals and horns at various places on the track. And current customer does not do that or desire that, so most of this wire is just going away. What will remain, of course, is the chuff trigger and the chuff trigger ground connection and various power delivery at the other end. At this point, I'm getting rid of my arch nemesis, the much maligned double sticky foam tape, trying to get it off this IC so it can, I guess breathe would be a terminology. It's extremely difficult to remove, but I did get it all off. While struggling to get all that double sticky foam off, the 3D printer has completed its tasks in the background, and so now I've got a couple of custom-made brackets that are just right to hold on to my cards. And these are the things that I'll tape or double sticky adhese to the chassis of the locomotive, or well, I guess the tender in this case. And now we're just trying to kind of trial dry fit everything. Oh, make sure we got an idea of where we're going to put stuff, how the wiring is going to work, and whether it's all actually going to fit in the proposed spaces. And so that's all this is, just a dry fit. And it looks like it's all going to work exactly like I planned, and making this project significantly easier than it possibly could have been. Yeah. This 20-year-old model features incandescent light bulbs, or grain of rice bulbs. And they're beautiful and warm and look right. So I'm not going to remove those, but I do need to figure out how to make them go. In this case, it's got a polarity sensitive circuit board back there to define whether the front or rear headlight should be on. We'll just take a very quick moment here to slap a little red heat shrink on the positive lead so I don't forget it as we move down the road with this model. Well, I often rail against double-sided foam sticky tape. 3M VHB, or very high bond double-sided adhesives, do share or do have a warm place in my heart, and what you're seeing right here is where that place is. Attaching a structural piece to a structural piece, not an electronics thing. The other thing we didn't talk about, this bracket also adds to my serviceability story, which means you can get these cards out without destructive action required. You can just unclip them from these boards and they pop out. In order to control the train through little hidden accessories, we need to be able to charge it. We'll turn it on and off. Also, when I put something together with a high-power lithium battery, I install a fuse. In this case, we're going to use a thing called a polyfuse. That's what I'm holding in my hand right there. I'm digging around for one that I think is big enough for this giant motor. Yeah, and these are little, temperature sensitive resistors. Essentially, they're 0 ohms at very low currents, and at high currents they suddenly become a switch. Speaking of switches, here's our power on off switch. This is where things got sort of interesting. So, looking hard at the locomotive and the tender. These are the reed switches I'm trying to pry off here that would trigger sound in a specific location on the track. But take a close look at the pickups that are right in between these reed switches and kind of glued all over the truck. I mentioned this before about talking about documentation. I am not the first person who's been in this locomotive, and I won't be the last one. And so what's interesting about this is that these pickups have nothing to do with Accucraft. I don't know where these pickups came from. In a real Accucraft model, the pickups will be up in the locomotive. And in this locomotive, there are no pickups up there. So we don't know exactly what's going on. And this is also where we discovered that things are not right with that particular truck I'm playing with. We'll watch in the next clip. We'll see what happens. When you upgrade a locomotive to work off of battery power, one of the things you have to do is you have to remove the pickups or disconnect them someplace. And so in this case, these are they're pretty ratty looking. They're definitely after the fact, done with some care at the time, but still something we don't need. But as I tugged and pulled on this, we'll show you the missing part here in a second. Things really started going wrong. And so now the truck has just fallen apart in front of my face, and I have no idea why. And yeah, pay attention when you buy that used locomotive, friends. So a little investigation shows me that what happened here at some point is a retainer clip that holds that strut bar assembly. So you got the center bar, and then you've got the axle bars that are spring-loaded. And what you can see on that back strut bar that's still in place, there's threaded holes right here. I'm showing the wrong thing. There's something missing. And there's what's missing is the model of the brake shoes, which forms a retaining clip for the truss bar at the end that's spring supported. And in fact, the other one is already missing a couple of screws. And so we talked to Accucraft, who essentially laughed at us, said, "We haven't made this locomotive in 20 years. We don't have any of those." So we formulated our own. I really love Legos. In this case, they're going to help support our serviceability goal. Instead of using just a giant hunk of double sticky tape across the entire bottom of that battery, we're going to put 2 little tiny ones. This will allow the battery to breathe and exude heat. We don't think that'll be a big problem, but it'll make it much easier to replace the battery in the future because, well, that battery does have a lifetime and it will need to be removed. While John's off machining a replacement truck part, we'll start working on the wiring harness. We'll start with power switch and power jack and integrated fuse circuit protection. Like every model needs, they're going to go right into that water access hole there at the back of the tender. This turned into sort of a bust. The power switch went in quite easily, just like normal. I pre-soldered some wires to it. The issue here is like the locomotive, the tender is extremely difficult to disassemble. As a matter of fact, I'm not sure I could disassemble it because I think there are parts soldered together that prevent that from happening. But I don't know that for a fact because I didn't actually try. I just was able to do what I wanted to do by reaching my hand back there. The problem with the power jack is I couldn't, no matter how hard I tried, the nut I needed to get on from the backside inside the tender, I just couldn't do it. I just tried and tried and tried and tried. I must have wasted 2 hours just fiddling around trying to figure out how to get that nut to start. And so finally I just gave up. You'll see the solution here in a second. And so falling back to a ready-made jack that is already wired and has no nut, and my favorite adhesive, hot melt glue. We're just going to take this jack and install it, and surprisingly, I think it came out very nice and very clean. Now that we have a power switch installed, it's time to move on to creating the harness that'll go from the battery to the various cards. We need to supply 15 volts from the battery to both the Airwire decoder and the Phoenix sound card, and provide a little bit of protection at the same time. Here are with a basically complete chassis. We've got a jack to plug in the charger. We've got the tail light assembly separated and polarized. We've got a power switch. We've got a connection to the battery with built-in circuit protection. And we have 2 plus battery connections and 2 ground connections, one for the decoder and one for the sound card. So that's a basic harness. It usually gets a little more complicated, you'll see, as I keep soldering more wires. We're not done here yet. What we haven't talked about is the connection between the tender and the locomotive at this point. This is a little kit from Amazon. These are JST, or Japanese Solderless Terminal Corporation connectors. You can't just say JST, you got to say what kind. And so XH is the same size you would see on any Bachmann train, for instance. And this little kit comes with some pre-crimped ends, which is really good. I've got the crimpers, but yeah, it's really tedious to deal with. So much easier just to grab a pre-crimped wire and shove it in the connector, and away you go. And so the male connector will go on the locomotive side, and the female connector, which is the live, will represent live voltage and stuff like that, will go on the tender side. And so I'm working on the tender side wires right now. And this will all get kind of glommed to the back of that locomotive. We'll show you how I go about that here in a moment or two. I have to admit that I'm something of a label junkie. I like my label machines. I have several of them. This one pumps out really nice labels designed for Ethernet wiring, but my career there is dead. So now I trim out little pieces of the labels and use them on my trains. This train is such a nice locomotive and such a nice model. I decided to really try to go all out in terms of A, documenting what I did, and B, the quality of work inside. So every wire is going to get a label explaining what it is. And so again, going back to the serviceability story, I will not be the last person to work on this train, and somebody after me will appreciate the fact that I took a moment to label everything. This is where things started getting challenging. There's no schematic from the Accucraft people in any way, shape, or form, and I can't see where the wires go. And so I teased this rat nest for a while, took apart the terminal block that I didn't understand, and finally wrestled out that the motor, the chuff sensor was easy to find, and the headlight. What I never did figure out, and we previously noted we don't care, is how to hook up the smoke generator. We have our connector, the male connector, connected to all the wires that I've previously identified and need to have hooked up. So heat shrink them all in place a little bit, and put some heat shrink over to the wires we terminated that we're just not going to use anymore. And all this worked really well because I didn't have to take very much apart on the locomotive, because it as previously noted, it would be very difficult. We'll skip forward a little bit and we'll see how this actually turns out. I think it came out pretty good. So now that I have this all soldered up and connected, I've got to figure out how to mechanically connect this connector to the back of the locomotive. That involves, first of all, kind of reassembling it. I had taken off the hitch bar for the tender and gotten it out of the way, and then experimented with a couple of ideas on how to attach this connector. What I finally ended up thinking about was just building a small bridge with my 3D printer. And that idea seemed to work out. The bridge would reach over the tender coupler, and give us lots of room there. I'm making measurements to figure out what to do. After a few minutes at the 3D printer, we have a part that I can adhere to the train in such a way that it doesn't get much in the way of anything. And in this case, I am using cyanoacetate glue, the dissimilar materials, and the necessary high bond strength. That's what I'm looking for here. So second favorite glue, see, whatever. This part's going to go right on here, and then I'm going to dab some paint on it, and it will disappear into the locomotive. I'll be the first to admit that this is not hugely attractive looking, but it is going to be underneath the train where you literally can't see it. So the big deal is just to cover up all the bright white parts so it doesn't glare as standing out from underneath there. And there's actually still a couple missing pieces that are going to cover this up even more, I think. The locomotive side is all finished, and here I am just testing it real briefly. I'll set the chuff sensor aside. That's the white and the yellow wire. The red and the black are the motor, and the green and the blue are the headlight. And I think it all came together very nicely. And just to make sure, we're going to hook it up to some live voltage and see it go. And a quick layout test just to see how my wiring is going to route as it enters the tender. Plug it all together. Give the wires a little flex. And you can see the access hole directly above where the wires terminate. The Airwire G4 comes with pre-made wire harness assemblies for the lights and smoke and stuff like that. And my general practice is just to figure out what you're going to use and remove all the extra wires. And so that's what I'm doing here, is I'm just pulling this thing apart so there's nothing but, the headlight and the tail light. We've reached a point where we're actually going to start assembling some of this in a serious way. So first of all, some alcohol. Make sure that VHB tape isn't wasted and that it sticks for a very, very, very long time. I lied about the outputs to the card. What really can happen, I'm going to have an output for a headlight and an output for a tail light, and two more outlets, one for the horn and one for the whistle. And those will be tied to the triggers on the Phoenix Big Sound 97 card. And so that's what I'm doing right here, is working on the harness that will reach between the two cards. There is not a DCC connection. The Big Sound is pre-DCC aware. So all you can do for this thing is take up a function button using the Elite LED controls on the Airwire side. Now we're getting down to the nitty-gritty final end of this thing. We've got our connector to go between the locomotive and the tender sitting there, and the wires we need to connect to. And I'm just cutting up a wide assortment of heat shrink and whatnot, so as I solder all the wires together and leave all those ugly solder joints underneath, we can cover them all up real nice. We're about in the final soldering area here. Trying to do a good job here, trying to go careful and get these solder joints to be good and solid, stress releasing with a good piece of heat shrink. It's not just for isolation, but to keep them from bending. This is not a thing you want to come fix later if you can avoid it. And there you have it, a new electrical gooseneck between the tender and the locomotive. And here we are dressing up the final product and testing for fit, and it looks like I did okay. This train is supposed to go around a 4-foot radius, so we've got enough service loop in there to really bend that wire. I don't believe it'll go around 4 feet, but who knows? We'll see. Oh, and speaking of the broken truck, we'll get back to that in a minute. The broken truck turned out to be an actual missing part. As you can see here, I'm high speed and through some stuff. So this emulated brake shoe thing actually works as a circlip to hold the spring bar, axle bar in place on the end of the crossbar. And so here I'm holding the newly manufactured version that the owner made me, except it doesn't quite fit. And so you get to watch me use a few tools, a few hand tools, a few power tools, and manipulate this piece of brass a little bit so that it can replicate the retaining clip portion, or action going on. And it seemed like no matter what I did, there was something not quite right about the part, but we finally got it to work. And the results, I think, are quite fabulous. I would consider it a complete repair. And here we get to finally actually put the whole thing back together for good with the new part. The video sped up 4 times and it still took me forever. springs went flying. I didn't capture that. Sorry about that. I did until I finally came down with the technique to get the springs in there. And then, of course, the part looked like it fit, but really didn't fit. So then there was a little frustration there. And then when I got all together, I realized I had to take it back apart to fit the axles in that I forgot to place. So, yeah, a fun dance here. Sort of like Keystone Cops with train wheels. And here's where I get all kind of huffy for a moment, which is, unfortunately, I didn't say anything. Turns out that the holes are drilled just a little bit off center, and yeah, can't get the screw in. So, yeah, more Keystone Cops. While you're watching me do Keystone Cops on this truck, let me tell you a little bit more about Accucraft axles and wheels. We all think of our modern train wheels as being insulated from the axle that you rub up against the wheel to do your pickup and get electricity. And I already talked about, or briefly mentioned, how you have to disconnect all that when you install batteries. Well, we had this weird problem with this train after we took it to a DCC powered track where it was shorting out the track. And both of us are kind of scratching our heads going, how could that possibly be? There's nothing connected to these wheels. How, what? Over? And so it turns out that the Accucraft axles and wheels only have one insulated wheel. And so if you take a truck apart like this and you turn the axles around 180 degrees, you can create a direct short across the rails through the truck. And yeah, we didn't discover that till after the fact, but pretty surprising. So keep that in mind if you ever take one of these apart. There is a right and a wrong to those axles. And it's pretty easy to see. Look for the nylon bushing. Even after all this oiling, that truck still squeaks a little bit. I think it's the end of the crossbar hitting in there where I can't get the oiler. Whoever owned this locomotive had also sort of neglected basic lubrication in a lot of areas, not just the running gear on the easy to access outside of the motor, but these very clear grease troughs that are supposed to be filled full of grease. Keep it all nice and lubed and happy during its lifetime. It is a 27-pound model after all. Now that we have the truck fixed, it's time to get down to the final details. We've got the gooseneck out to the locomotive all figured out. So now we're installing the battery and the smallish pieces of 3M VHB and hooking the battery up, and that should be it. And so here's a better clue of what it looks like from up above. Harness going from the various boards out the bottom, in this view, out at the bottom of the tender to the hookup. That's the G4 decoder I'm fondling. The antenna we're just going to leave sticking out that little crack right there, and that turns out to be just fine. And so, with a little hand wringing, let's see. So that's very encouraging. So let's try and check out some of the other functions now. Look to make sure the headlight turns on and off, and it does. Should also check to see the tail light does the same thing. I went through a lot of trouble to figure that out, and sure enough. And so now the last couple of details is back to the label maker I love, and start giving a little bit more labeling to stuff that we need to see from the outside of the locomotive. This is one of my major disappointments. Initially, I should have just hit that with an X-Acto knife with a little cross pattern and a heat gun a little bit and pushed that down over that tit. But I didn't. I just left it. And it's bugging me still, months later. The Big Sound 97 is quite the legacy device. In 1997, cheap NVRAM, for instance, or non-volatile memory of any kind was ludicrously expensive for this kind of a toy. So as a result, the Big Sound doesn't remember what the volume was set at the last time you played with it. And so if you don't want it just on full volume all the time, you need to be able to access the volume control. And I often, one of my pet peeves is I often see switches on locomotives with no label whatsoever on them. And often they're these momentary left-right switches for a Phoenix sound card. And so in this case, knowing that it might want to be adjusted on a routine basis, I made it easy to access with a little 3D printed bracket. You just pull the coal load up and it's right there, and apply a label so that there's no questioning about what you're doing when you flip the switch. And yeah, that came out pretty nice. This is the dressing of the external antenna for the G4 decoder. Because this model is brass, that tender is a Faraday cage, and we need to get an antenna outside of it somehow. And I was all kind of worried about that first warning about buying an external, like a little rubber ducky antenna or something. But it turns out that just exposing half the antenna above the coal load itself is also brass, so it's part of the Faraday cage. Works just fine. That it works from big distances, and we tested it, and it's just happy. And also, you just can't, you can't hardly see it. There's a little white tit sticking out there. It's almost invisible. Now we'll give it just one last test before setting it free in the wild. We were very, very fortunate to be able to go out to 19 Acres Cider to test out the train. And remember, this is before we knew about the opposing axle issue, and so we'd realized that there was something shorting out the track, and so this layout's all turned off. And if you want to know more about this layout, just put Tom Miller F-Scale in the Google search, or the YouTube search, and you'll see all kinds of stuff about it. It is quite an exotic layout. And with that, we'll call this a done project. We'll leave you to a little bit of test track, and see you next video. And lastly, hokey as this sounds, like and subscribe. I don't put out videos super often, and mostly I've been trying to work on quality, making them better. So let me know if you think they're interesting. Leave a comment. I respond to all comments, positive or negative. All right. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.